must be ready.
In 1851, a young woman stood in the cold hallway of a luxurious London mansion, clutching tightly the single wooden trunk containing her belongings. The lady of the house slowly descended the grand staircase, gave the new servant a curt once-over, and pointedly ignored the document bearing her real name. With a single curt command, the aristocrat erased this peasant woman's past life forever, ordering her to answer to a name that was completely foreign to her from that moment on. This cold scene was not a one-off whim of an arrogant lady, but a strict rule of the entire Victorian domestic service system. What if I told you that 1 million people willingly gave up their identities for the chance to get a job in a wealthy household? This exceeded all expectations of modern historians, who began studying old household registers and the personal diaries of servants from that era. The hidden truth, long silenced by biographers of great British families, turned out to be far more complex than simple tales of a hard life. You'll see a mechanism for erasing one's identity that worked so effectively that people forgot their own past and their roots. Such practices change our perception of this glittering era, revealing the hidden cost of the 19th century elite's impeccable comfort. What happens behind the closed doors of luxurious villas is always different from the idyllic picture painted in the pages of historical novels. In this video, you'll find a detailed analysis of the actual practice of renaming domestic servants in Victorian England. We'll examine the rules established by famous authors of the time and look at the consequences of these rules through the eyes of ordinary workers. You'll learn how the psychology of erasing one's identity worked and why, after 10 years of service, many women could no longer remember their real names. We'll trace the story of one young woman whose journey began in that very cold hallway and ended with her full acceptance of the new rules of the game. Watch the video to the end and you'll discover the true cost of impeccable order in the homes of the wealthiest people in the British Empire. In the mid-19th century, British society was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom, which created a huge demand for domestic servants. The newly wealthy industrialists and merchants wanted to live like the old aristocracy, and to do so, they needed an impeccable staff. It was at this very moment that Isabella Beeton appeared on the historical stage, determined to bring order to the chaos of household management. Her famous book on household management became a veritable Bible for thousands of British women. Isabella Beeton did not simply write a collection of recipes, she created a strict set of rules for managing every aspect of the servants' lives. She systematized the duties, wages, and rules of conduct for all categories of domestic workers, from the house manager to the dishwasher. In her view, the ideal home was supposed to run like a precise clockwork mechanism, where every cog knew its place. To achieve such efficiency, the personal interests of the servants had to be completely subordinated to the needs of their strict employers. This rigid system of management became the standard for all of Victorian society for many decades. An important part of this standard was the requirement that domestic staff remain completely invisible in the family's daily life. Servants were instructed to move about the house silently, using special hidden staircases and corridors so as not to be seen by their employers. Encountering a servant in the reception rooms was considered a serious breach of discipline, which could result in a stern reprimand. Work was expected to be performed as if by magic, while the employers were asleep or in other rooms. This principle of invisibility was the first step toward the complete depersonalization of thousands of young men and women. The employers did not want to waste time memorizing new names if the staff in their homes changed too often. This was especially true for junior maids and cooks, among whom staff turnover was extremely high. It seemed absurd to the aristocracy to memorize the complicated or unusual name of a young woman who might leave their home in a couple of months. It was much more convenient to use standard names that were assigned to a specific position in the household rather than to a person. Thus was born the practice of renaming, which dealt the heaviest blow to the psychology of domestic workers. A historian of 19th century social life notes that changing one's name was a kind of rite of passage. Upon crossing the threshold of her employer's home, a young woman left her family, her past, and her former identity behind. She accepted a new set of rules in which her own self held absolutely no significance for those around her. This process required a tremendous internal adjustment, as she had to constantly control her reactions to how others addressed her. Many viewed this as a necessary evil, essential for securing a stable income and a roof over their heads. The process of adapting to the new conditions was difficult, placing enormous emotional strain on the young workers. They had to learn to suppress their natural reactions and get used to a constant sense of their own insignificance. Each day began early in the morning and consisted of monotonous, physically exhausting work to maintain the comfort of others. Under such conditions, maintaining a connection to one's real name remained for many the only way not to lose themselves. However, the system operated ruthlessly, methodically erasing any remnants of individuality from these people's consciousness. The establishment of such strict boundaries was driven by the upper class's desire to insulate itself from the growing influence of the working class. The house was viewed as a fortress where the aristocracy could maintain complete control over its surroundings and enforce its own laws. Erasing the servants' identities helped the masters maintain the illusion of their absolute superiority and infallibility. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about this system of total control over a worker's identity? Share your thoughts in the comments. The practice of renaming servants in Victorian England was not merely a whim, but a well-oiled administrative mechanism. If a senior maid named Mary was already working in the household, a new maid with the same name would immediately be given a different one. Conversely, if a position was traditionally named after a specific name, every new employee would automatically take on that name. This created a situation where 5 different maids could successively work in the same household, all sharing the same name. The most popular name for junior maids was Mary, which became synonymous with domestic service. For footmen, the names John or James were often used, regardless of their baptismal names. A mistress might simply declare that the name Elizabeth was too noble for a dishwasher and order that she be called Sarah. Such decisions were made unilaterally, without the slightest discussion with the worker herself. The young woman was expected to nod silently and, from that moment on, respond only to her new name. The process of being estranged from her own name did not happen immediately. It required time and constant psychological pressure. In the first few weeks, a new servant often failed to respond when the mistress addressed her, forgetting that she was now called by a different name. Every such slip-up was followed by a stern reprimand, or even a fine deducted from her already meager salary. The young women had to constantly keep themselves on edge in order to respond in time to a name that was completely foreign to them. Gradually, this led to the new name becoming firmly imprinted in their subconscious, supplanting their real one. Co-workers were also forced to use fictitious names when communicating with one another during work hours. Senior staff strictly enforced this rule to avoid incurring the master's wrath. During their rare moments of rest under the stairs, the servants could whisper each other's real names, but this happened infrequently. The constant use of a false name, even among peers, accelerated the process of losing one's identity. Over time, the line between one's true self and one's work role was completely erased. For many peasant girls who had come from remote villages, their name was their main connection to their family. Losing that name was perceived as a break with home and a betrayal of their own rural roots. However, economic necessity forced them to put up with this humiliation for the sake of a stable income. They sent part of their earnings home, signing their letters with their real names, as if trying to hold on to a slipping reality. But with each passing year, these letters grew shorter, and their connection to their former lives grew weaker. Historical documents show that the practice of renaming was not limited to low-ranking domestic servants. Even governesses from impoverished noble families were sometimes subjected to similar treatment by their employers. Their names might be changed if they coincided with that of the mistress or one of the daughters in a wealthy household. This underscored the employer's total control over every aspect of the lives of those under their authority. No past merits or good education could protect a person from this humiliating procedure. In rare cases, female workers managed to retain their real names if they possessed unique and irreplaceable skills. An experienced cook capable of organizing a dinner party for 50 people could dictate her own terms even to a strict mistress. But for millions of ordinary maids and dishwashers, such a privilege simply did not exist. They remained faceless cogs in the vast machinery that ensured the comfort of the British Empire. Their silent consent to being renamed was the price they paid for their survival. The mechanism for erasing individuality worked flawlessly, turning hundreds of thousands of people into submissive executors of someone else's will. The loss of a name was only the beginning of a long journey toward the complete renunciation of their own desires and ambitions. This process demanded enormous personal sacrifices, which were rarely mentioned in official documents. Are you ready to learn the truth about the methods of psychological pressure used after the name change? After being stripped of her name, the second stage of psychological transformation began, which historians refer to as the process of artificial invisibility. A maid was not allowed to speak to her employers first unless they addressed her directly with a specific request. She was instructed to look away when encountering family members in the hallways or on the stairs. Any display of emotion, be it a smile, fatigue, or anger, was considered a gross violation of professional ethics. It is precisely this complex psychological process that is brilliantly described in the personal diaries of Hannah Calwick, one of the most famous maids of the Victorian era. Hannah began her working life at age 8 and worked her way through all the stages of arduous domestic labor while retaining the ability to analyze what was happening around her. She deliberately chose the hardest work, calling herself a dishwasher to emphasize her social status. In her writings, we see a striking picture of a split personality where her working role completely suppresses her human desires. Hannah describes how she learnt to become an invisible shadow, gliding silently through the dark corners of enormous mansions. Hannah Calwick describes in detail her experience of wearing heavy work clothes that restricted her movements and concealed her figure. The uniform was not merely work attire, but a marker of social status that could not be removed even during her rare hours of rest. The masters deliberately ignored the servants' presence in the room, discussing personal matters and financial issues right in front of them. To the aristocrats, a maid with a rag was no more of a living being than a wooden chair or a grandfather clock. This attitude inflicted deep psychological damage, causing a person to doubt their own significance and right to exist. Servants became silent keepers of others' secrets, unable to share their own experiences. This emotional loneliness amid a crowd of people was the most grueling ordeal of Victorian domestic labour. For Hannah Calwick, keeping a diary became the only way to preserve her true self and keep from losing her mind. In her notebooks, she could be herself, describing her exhaustion, the pain in her calloused hands, and rare moments of joy. The anticipation of being summoned kept the workers in a state of constant nervous tension from early morning until late at night. They could not relax even during meals, as the sharp ring of a bell could sound at any moment. This led to chronic fatigue and nervous breakdowns, which, of course, were carefully concealed from employers. It was forbidden to get sick, since an invisible shadow has no right to physical suffering or sudden weakness. A sick servant was most often simply fired and replaced with a new, healthy, and nameless worker. Psychological isolation was exacerbated by strict rules forbidding servants from forming romantic relationships or receiving guests. Days off were granted extremely rarely, usually once a month or even once a quarter. The rest of the time, the worker was required to remain on the employer's property, not leaving its boundaries without permission. This isolation from the outside world meant that the house became the servant's entire universe. External ties were severed, and the person remained completely dependent on the will of their wealthy employers. The mechanism for turning a person into a faceless function operated seamlessly, relying on strict social norms and economic necessity. Young women, like Hannah Kalvik, existed for years in this parallel reality, where their real names and faces were erased. But while relationships with their employers were strictly regulated, within the servants' community itself, true Shakespearean passions raged. Would you like to learn how the brutal social hierarchy was structured among those who lived below ground level? What went on in the shadows of the luxurious halls was often far more complex than the official rules of Victorian etiquette. Beneath the stairs, in the dimly lit kitchens and damp hallways, there existed a caste system of its own, one that was incredibly rigid. Senior servants, such as the butler and the housekeeper, wielded enormous power and demanded unquestioning respect. They ate in a separate room, were served the finest food, and were addressed exclusively by their last names with a respectful title. This elite group of servants jealously guarded their privileges, brutally suppressing any attempts at insubordination by lower-ranking staff. The position of housekeeper in a large household was akin to that of a general commanding an entire army of obedient soldiers. She wore a bunch of keys to all the pantries on her belt, symbolizing her absolute control over the household's resources. The housekeeper personally hired and fired the junior maids, imposed fines on them, and assigned them the hardest work. For a simple girl named Mary, the housekeeper's wrath was far more terrifying than the displeasure of the lady of the house herself, who lived on the upper floor. It was the housekeeper who ensured that the process of erasing one's individuality was carried out strictly according to established rules. The butler, standing at the top of the male hierarchy, supervised the footmen, valets, and errand boys. His status was underscored by an impeccable suit, which often cost more than the clothes of some of the guests in this wealthy household. He was responsible for the wine cellar, the silverware, and the overall organization of formal receptions, and had access to the family's deepest secrets. The junior footmen trembled before him, as a single word from him could ruin their careers in wealthy households forever. The butler never did the dirty work himself, delegating it to the nameless Johns and Jameses lower down the ranks. In this strict hierarchy, every promotion meant not only a raise in salary, but also the restoration of some rights to individuality. Upon becoming a senior maid, a young woman could reclaim her real name if it did not coincide with the names of her employers. She gained the right to command her juniors and was spared the most grueling physical housework. This faint glimmer of hope for career advancement compelled many to endure humiliation for years, hoping to one day rise above the lowest ranks. However, only a handful ever reached the top, while the majority remained perpetual Marys stuck in hard labor. In her journals, Hannah Kalvik noted that she deliberately turned down promotions, preferring to remain a manual laborer. Her choice seemed insane to her colleagues, since she was voluntarily condemning herself to the lowest rung of the social ladder. But for Hannah, it was a unique way to preserve her inner freedom by staying out of the cruel intrigues of the senior servants. At the very bottom of the hierarchy, all that was required of her was hard labor, leaving her thoughts in relative peace. She understood that power over others inevitably changes a person, and she did not want to become part of the repressive apparatus. There was mutual support among the lower-ranking staff, but it was always hidden from the watchful eyes of the superiors. The girls might secretly help a tired friend finish washing the dishes or hide a piece of bread for a hungry dishwasher. These small acts of solidarity helped them retain their humanity within a system that demanded they become machines. They shared snippets of news from home, quietly hummed songs from their native villages, and supported one another. It was in these rare moments that they became themselves again, remembering their real names and their past lives. The complex structure of the home's administration was a miniature replica of Victorian England's class-based society. It reflected all the prejudices of that era, amplified by the confinement of the closed space. Each person was trapped in their social role, unable to step outside its rigid boundaries. Can you guess what happened next when the rules became even stricter? The hidden code that changed everything was contained in a single document, a letter of recommendation from a former employer. In the 19th century, This small piece of paper held the power of life and death over any member of the working class. Without a good reference, a maid could not find employment in any respectable household, losing her only source of income. Employers were well aware of their power and used the reference as their primary tool for blackmail and coercion. The threat of dismissal without a reference hung over every young woman like the sword of Damocles, forcing her to endure any humiliation. Pregnancy for an unmarried maid meant immediate dismissal in disgrace and no chance whatsoever of receiving a letter of recommendation. Victorian society was characterized by extreme puritanism and did not forgive women for such violations of moral norms. Finding themselves on the street without money or identification, these young women were often forced to resort to extreme measures just to survive. Many of them joined the ranks of the destitute on London streets, disappearing forever into the dark alleys of the slums. The tragedy lay in the fact that the culprit was often one of the senior servants or guests in the household. Jane Welsh Carlyle did not hesitate to dismiss her maids for the slightest sign of disobedience or a bad mood. In her letters, we see the cold calculation with which she replaced one servant with another, as if they were gloves. She demanded perfect obedience, and any hint of discontent on a maid's face was taken as a personal insult. This approach was typical of her social class, where servants were viewed as expendable resources for ensuring comfort. The former mistress had no interest in the fate of the dismissed women, for there was always a line of new applicants waiting outside the door. The dismissal process was swift and humiliating, leaving no time to pack or say goodbye to colleagues. The housekeeper ordered the young woman to immediately pack her wooden trunk and leave the premises through the back door. She was paid only for the days she actually worked, and they often withheld money from her pay for fabricated offences and damage to property. Once outside the gates, the former Mary stood on the street with her meagre belongings, not knowing where to go next. It was a moment of utter despair when the system spat a person out after squeezing every last ounce of strength from them. The employers kept special blacklists on which they recorded the names of unreliable workers and passed them on to their acquaintances. Being placed on such a list meant a blacklist that closed the doors of all the wealthy households in the area. It was an informal but extremely effective network of control created by the aristocracy to protect their interests. The nameless young woman could not stand up to this powerful machine, capable of destroying her reputation with a single word. The employers' solidarity was absolute, and they always supported one another in conflicts with their servants. Strict dismissal rules were merely the tip of the iceberg in the complex economy of Victorian domestic labour. These people's lives depended on a multitude of factors of which they were often completely unaware. Can you guess where these endless streams of cheap labour, willing to endure any hardship, came from? The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the origins of the army of nameless female workers in Victorian mansions. The overwhelming majority of these young women came to London and other major cities from remote agricultural regions of the country. The agricultural revolution and the mechanization of labor deprived thousands of peasant families of their traditional livelihoods, forcing them to seek new ways to survive. For many parents, sending their daughter to work in a wealthy household became the only way to save their family from poverty. These young migrants arrived at the capital's train stations, frightened by the noise of the metropolis and willing to take on any job. Rural girls were highly valued by urban employers for their physical stamina, docility, and lack of exposure to urban vices. Housekeepers believed that a peasant girl would be better suited to carrying heavy buckets of coal and doing endless loads of laundry. Furthermore, rural women were less prone to arguments and more easily subjected to the process of renaming and depersonalization. Their natural modesty and fear of authority made them ideal material for creating the perfect invisible servants. Employers specifically sought out workers from remote counties to minimize their contact with the outside world. The separation from their families was not only physical but also cultural, as the young women found themselves in a completely different environment. They had to rid themselves of their provincial accents which grated on the refined ears of their aristocratic employers. Isabella Beeton advised housewives to correct their maids' speech so that they would speak quietly, correctly, and strictly to the point. Abandoning their native dialect was yet another step toward the complete loss of their original identity. Their native language was replaced by a dry set of standard phrases spoken in a faceless tone. Employers actively encouraged this detachment from one's roots, believing that a lonely worker serves much more diligently. A young woman with nowhere else to go would not demand a raise or better working conditions for fear of being fired. She channeled all her unspent energy into polishing silver, scrubbing the parquet floors, and maintaining perfect order. The system was designed to drain all the vitality from these provincial women for the sake of the capital's elite. In return, they received only a roof over their heads, meagre food, and a false name that erased their past. Jane Welsh Carlyle often recruited maids from Scotland, counting on their notorious work ethic and Protestant work ethic. However, even they could not meet her excessive demands, and staff turnover occurred with alarming regularity. The writer complained about their rough manners, forgetting that these girls had been torn from their familiar surroundings. The clash of two worlds, the refined literary elite and the harsh reality of peasant life, always ended in victory for the former. The Scottish Marys returned home or vanished into the slums of London, making way for new victims of the system. This geographical displacement was not merely a change of residence, but a true shift in the entire paradigm of human existence. Country girls surrendered their youth, health, and very identities to the capital, becoming invisible shadows of someone else's grandeur. This process of mass urbanization forever altered Britain's demographic landscape, creating a vast class of service workers. Can you guess what happened to their money within this ruthless system? The economic model of Victorian domestic labour was based on the total exploitation of the lower classes at minimal financial cost to employers. A junior maid's wages were so meagre that she could not save enough to live independently. The primary form of compensation was considered to be the provision of lodging, work clothes, and meagre meals, which often consisted of leftovers. Cash was paid out extremely rarely, usually once a quarter, and most of it went toward fines or was sent to family members. In her book, Isabella Beeton laid out in detail the ideal budget for maintaining a household staff of various ranks. She recommended strictly controlling food expenses for the staff by replacing expensive ingredients with cheaper alternatives and limiting portion sizes. Tea, sugar, and meat were distributed strictly according to rations, and severe deductions were made from the cook's wages for exceeding food quotas. These meticulous savings on people's basic needs allowed the aristocracy to maintain their luxurious lifestyle and host grand receptions. Economic efficiency was achieved at the expense of constant malnutrition and physical exhaustion among those who lived below ground level. Hannah Calvick, despite her vast experience and incredible work ethic, received the meagre wages of a lowly dishwasher. She deliberately did not ask for a raise, as maintaining her inner independence was more important to her than financial well-being. However, most of her colleagues were desperately in need of money, trying to save even a small sum for a dowry. Without these savings, they could not hope for a successful marriage and an escape from the vicious cycle of domestic servitude. But the system of fines for the slightest infractions constantly wiped out their meagre savings, shattering their dreams of a better future. In her letters to relatives, Jane Welsh Carlyle often complained about the high cost of maintaining a London home and staff. At the same time, she failed to mention that her maids performed a workload that would have required 3 times as many people. Cutting back on staff led to a colossal physical strain on the remaining workers, who laboured 16 hours a day. They had to find time to cook, clean the vast premises, wash heavy linens, and carry out their mistress's minor errands. This grueling labour was not paid extra, as it was viewed as a self-evident duty of a faceless role. The lack of a pension made old age the worst nightmare for any member of the service class in Victorian England. If a worker lost her health or simply grew old, she was ruthlessly thrown out onto the street and replaced by a young, strong girl. There were, in principle, no severance payments or compensation for health lost due to hard labor. Old maids, who had devoted their entire lives to other people's families, often ended their days in the appalling conditions of workhouses. This bleak prospect forced young Marys to work themselves to the bone, trying to save at least a couple of shillings for a rainy day. Servants were extremely frugal with money. Every penny earned was of immense value and significance. They sewed coins into the hems of their skirts and hid them under their mattresses, distrusting both banks and their older colleagues. The loss of these savings was seen as a true tragedy, capable of driving a person to despair or even suicide. Money was the only real resource that connected them to the outside world and offered a faint hope of liberation. For its sake, they endured being renamed, humiliation, hard labor, and the complete loss of their own human individuality. Money and power always go hand in hand, creating unbearable conditions for those deprived of both. Economic slavery compounded the psychological pressure, robbing the girls of their last chances to escape the vicious cycle. Can you imagine how the human psyche coped with such incredible pressure over many years? Despite total control, hard labor, and psychological pressure, human nature always seeks ways to resist the system. Servants found microscopic ways to express their individuality and assert their boundaries amid absolute submission to their masters. This resistance rarely took the form of open rebellion, as the cost of such a move was too high for the common person. More often than not, these were quiet, inconspicuous acts of sabotage that helped workers maintain their sense of dignity. One of the most common forms of resistance was deliberately slowing down work when there was no strict supervision from superiors. Maids might spend hours polishing the same tray, conserving their energy for the more physically demanding tasks of the evening. They masterfully created the appearance of frantic activity whenever the housekeeper or mistress walked past them in the mansion's hallway. This was a form of passive protest against the unrealistic demands of Isabella Beeton and other authors of household manuals like her. Conserving their own energy was a matter of physical survival amid meager rations and chronic sleep deprivation. Hannah Kalvik describes in her diaries how she found solace in the very process of hard labor, transforming it into a form of meditation. For her, cleaning the fireplace became not just a dirty job, but a way to clear her own thoughts of anxiety. She found beauty in a perfectly scrubbed floor or gleaming copper cookware, taking pride in her craftsmanship despite her employer's attitude. This reframing of her routine allowed her to remain in control of her own destiny, at least within the small sphere of responsibility entrusted to her. It served as a powerful psychological shield that prevented the system from completely breaking her will and self-respect. Reading cheap novels by the dim light of a candle was yet another way to escape the harsh reality of a Victorian mansion. Despite a strict ban on using candles for personal purposes, the maids would collect candle stubs and hide them under their mattresses. As they immersed themselves in worlds of noble knights and romantic tales, they forgot about their chafed hands and the housekeeper's harsh shouts. In these dreams, they once again became the heroines of their own lives, rather than nameless cogs in the background. Literature restored to them the right to emotions that were strictly forbidden during working hours by the rules of etiquette. Small acts of sabotage also took place, though they required incredible caution and precision in execution. A maid might accidentally oversalt the soup for an unpleasant guest, or leave a speck of dust in a conspicuous spot in the office of a strict employer. These subtle jabs were a way to vent pent-up aggression without exposing themselves to retaliation or the threat of dismissal. They created the illusion of control over the situation, demonstrating that the perfect domestic machinery was vulnerable to the will of an ordinary person. It was a delicate game of nerves, the rules of which were known only to the inhabitants of dark basements and shadowy stairwells. Their outward submission was merely a mask concealing the complex and rich inner worlds of these people. They had learned to survive within a system that sought to destroy them while retaining their ability to feel and think. Their resistance did not destroy the Victorian class system, but it allowed them to hold on to what remained of their sanity. The story of these nameless women is a story of the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of total oppression. They proved that even under the most grueling conditions, a person is capable of finding a way to remain human. Psychological games and covert resistance helped them survive the first, most difficult years of working in a stranger's home. But what happened when decades had passed and the mask had finally become a permanent part of their faces? Many years of work under conditions of the most brutal suppression of one's identity inevitably led to irreversible changes in the human psyche. The psychological boundary between one's real name and one's fictional role began to blur after about 5 years of continuous service. A person grew accustomed to responding to someone else's name, not only in the corridors of the mansion, but also in their own inner monologues. The role of the nameless Mary became a second skin, one that could no longer be shed without severe pain and psychological breakdown. Many women who had worked in aristocratic households for more than 10 years admitted that they could barely recall their childhoods. Memories of their home village, parents, and former friends seemed to them like the plot of a book they had read long ago. Their reality had shrunk to the confines of the kitchen, the pantry, and the grand staircase, which they had to clean every morning. The loss of connection to their past was the final stage of the process of erasing their identity, a process that began on their very first day of work. The mechanism described by Isabella Beeton was completing its work, producing a perfect, will-less servant. Hannah Calwick, despite her strong character and the fact that she kept a diary, also experienced profound identity crises. At times, she admitted that she felt more comfortable being a dirty dishwasher than trying to lead the life of an ordinary woman. The role of a servant provided her with clear rules of the game and freed her from the need to make complex decisions on her own. She became dependent on her subordinate position, finding in it a peculiar, perverse form of security. This psychological trap snapped shut on thousands of female workers, forever closing off their path to a normal, free life. Historical archives are full of records of female workers who, after being dismissed or following the death of their employers, ended up in mental institutions. Their diagnoses often described deep melancholy, a loss of spatial orientation, and a complete inability to live independently. Deprived of strict instructions and their familiar schedule of calls, these women simply did not know how to manage their time. Their willpower had atrophied over long years of constant submission, just as muscles atrophy without exercise. This was the most terrible and invisible price that British society paid for its ideal domestic order. The destruction of the self was a slow process that left no physical scars but crippled the soul forever. Every unspoken word, every stifled sigh, and every response to another's name brought them closer to the point of no return. The system worked flawlessly, creating an army of invisible shadows serving the grandeur of a vast and powerful empire. Their erased names became the foundation upon which the prosperity of the most influential families of that historical period rested. But every story has an end, and we must return to the scene with which we began our tale. The journey from a proud peasant girl to the docile Mary took years, but the result was always the same. Guess what that very girl in the cold London hallway realized after 10 years of uninterrupted service? Exactly 10 years have passed since that winter morning in 1851, when a young girl first crossed the threshold of a London mansion. She stands in that very same cold hallway, seeing off her aging mistress to yet another dinner party. She is wearing an immaculate dark dress, a perfectly starched white apron, and a plain bonnet that hides her greying hair. Her hands have become rough, her back is slightly hunched from years of carrying coal, and her gaze is habitually cast down toward the floor. When her mistress casually instructs Mary to tend the fireplace, the woman instantly and emotionlessly responds with a brief yes. In that brief moment, she suddenly realizes that the voice uttering these words sounds completely mechanical and alien. She tries to recall the name that was written on her old wooden chest 10 years ago. Her memory yields only fragments of images, a sun-drenched meadow, her mother's face, but the word itself slips away into the fog. 10 years of responding daily to someone else's name have taken their toll, erasing her true identity forever. At the end of her journey, Hannah Kalvik reached a strange compromise between her two personalities. She secretly married the aristocrat Arthur Manby, but continued to play the role of a maid, even in her own home. She refused to sit at the same table with him and preferred to polish his shoes, finding a twisted comfort in it. Her story shows how deeply the habit of submission and endless self-abasement takes root in the psyche. Once a person has lost themselves, they often can no longer find their way back to a normal perception of the world. Jane Welsh Carlyle passed away, leaving behind volumes of letters complaining about negligent maids. In her brilliant literary circle, no one ever gave a thought to the fates of those women who ensured their intellectual peace of mind. History has preserved the names of great writers, diplomats, and politicians, but the names of thousands of Marys have vanished without a trace. They remain only in the dry lines of accounting ledgers, where their wages were recorded alongside expenses for coal and meat. This historical injustice is only now beginning to be rectified through the efforts of contemporary researchers of everyday life. The girl who lost her name no longer writes letters home because she has no one to write to and nothing to write about. Her wooden chest has long since rotted away in the damp basement, and with it, the last tangible evidence of her past life has vanished. She lives for the present moment, waiting for the next ring of the bell that sets the rhythm of her artificial existence. There is no longer any room in her soul for anger or despair. An absolute, terrifying emptiness reigns there. She fulfills her role perfectly, having become exactly what the Victorian aristocracy wanted her to be. The final destination of our heroine's journey is the complete acceptance of her new, false reality without any attempt at rebellion. She no longer hides sugar cubes or reads cheap novels at night, for she no longer needs illusions. Her world has shrunk to the confines of her employer's house, and her life belongs to those who pay her a pittance. This is not physical death, but the absolute death of her identity, one that will not be mentioned in obituaries. Such was the real fate of 100,000 women, whose labour built the era of Britain's greatest power. We've travelled the path from a single day in a London hallway to the complete erasure of one's identity after long years of grueling labour. The heroine of this story reached the point of complete dissolution of herself, sacrificing her real name for the sake of survival. Her lost name became a symbol of a lost life, one that was voluntarily sacrificed on the altar of someone else's well-being and comfort. Do you think such forms of voluntary self-erasure are possible in today's corporate world? Share your thoughts in the comments, suggest topics for future videos, and be sure to subscribe to the channel.